live onto Facebook. So your question is going live onto Facebook. Just a minute, sorry. We have to go back here and welcome everybody. I haven't started recording yet, but we are streaming live on Facebook. Okay, I'm going to mute everybody, and then Netanel, if your question is relevant, you can unmute yourself, but I'm muting everybody now. And we are actually ready to start. So maybe you want to hold your question until we're further into the discussion. Okay, Parshat Noach. And in many ways, after last week's incredible Parsha with so much, 10 generations, this Parsha seems that it's got much less action. Of course, it also encompasses another 10 generations. And if you want to go, you delve down deep, we can find many stories. But I will have to say to you that we have only 2 major stories, as opposed to last week's Parsha, where it was story after story. And of course, this is the main story is the story of Noach and the flood. And then there's a secondary story of the Tower of Babel. And that is a story that I'm not going to focus on this week. I think I did this year. I think I did it in depth last year. And we might come back to it next year. But for this year, I want to get an overall a picture of the Parsha and the way it's structured and the way it goes on. Let me just admit Shelley and see how the Parsha pans out in a big picture. So if you're with me with your Tanachim, I just want to show you that the Parsha begins with, this is the offspring of Noach. As you will remember, the very end of last week's Parsha is that Noach matzah chen be'inei Hashem. Noach found chen, grace, a beautiful, nice word, in the eyes of God. What is the nice thing about the name Noach is chen, backwards. And the idea that Noach finds chen reminds me of how Ruth finds Torah, Ruth and Torah sort of backwards. The idea that our names contain in them, or playing around with our names, can often give us a lot of insight into the characteristics. So Noach and chen, it's there from the beginning. And then we begin with the very famous line that I've put in the handout. I've just put it in classic commentaries, but I'll mention it now because we're going to go through the whole Parsha. Noach was a righteous man, perfect in his generation, tzaddik, tamim, haya b'dorotav. And they ask the question, why do we say Noach was righteous in his generation? And there are 2 options. Either his generation was so awful that compared to any other generation, Noach would not have been considered a righteous man. So it's what we call a backhanded compliment. Or Noach was so amazingly righteous because, think about it, how amazing is it to be able to be righteous when your generation is so awful? If your generation is so awful and you can still be righteous, that is really saying something about you. And you can play around with that idea and leave open both those possibilities of how later on you're going to assess the righteousness of Noach. He had 3 sons. Now, there is significance in the fact that he had 3 sons when we're introduced here. And there's also significance in the ages of the sons, because there's an interesting question about what's going to happen now when the family of Noach is going to be saved. The family of Noach is going to be saved. How is it that the sons are going to be saved? Is it because they are righteous in their own right? Or is it on the basis of their father's righteousness? And it would be cruel not to save his sons and his wife along with him. In other words, are these 3 sons adults? who are responsible for their own righteousness, or are they still the children of Noah? And these questions partly depend on the way that you do your math at this time. We're going to see something fascinating in this Parsha, that the ages and time seems to be different before the flood than after the flood. The flood seems to change the rhythm of time in the world. We talked about it last week, that with the creation, we had the creation of time. But the rhythm, we've already conceded that the days of creation are unlikely to be. In fact, it's rather silly to suggest that they're 24-hour days, because we know that the creation of the sun and the moon that gives that rhythm isn't till day 4. So we're clearly not talking about that sort of day. And we also see the incredible ages that people lived to in those days. So there are ways of explaining it. We can say, that's because they didn't have any viruses or germs that killed them, so they could live on and on. We can also say that time was measured differently. So there are ways of explaining that. But after the flood, we seem to settle down to more what we would consider within normal range, or within range that we can imagine, even if it's longer than people live today. But there's another thing about the rhythm that I'm going to point out to you in a moment. But we're still at the very beginning. It says the earth has become corrupt. Now, if you remember last week, it said that the earth had become corrupt, and it mentions these, if you can flick back to to chapter 6, the end of last week's Parsha, it says that man had become, that the earth had become corrupt, and it talks about the wickedness of the man, and everything was evil, and it seems to be connected with the sexual intermingling with these Nephilim and these Bnei Elohim, and God seems very unhappy with them, and that's repeated the earth. But in this week's Parsha, the translation given here, which is based on Rashi, I'm using the Out Scroll again today, filled with robbery. Well, we don't know that the Hamas referred to here is robbery, or whether it's sexual corruption, or both. But the earth is very corrupt, and God decides to destroy it. And he tells Noach, I'm going to I'm going to bring an end to the rest of humanity. You are to build this ark. And it gives the dimensions of the ark. And there's a lot of discussion about what these dimensions represent, whether you can really think about holding 2 of all the species that were known in an ark of these dimension or any dimension whatsoever. So the idea that this ark has mystical qualities to hold 2 of every kind of animal. And there is significance, of course, in taking the male and female of each kind of animal. And this is something I'm going to refer to tomorrow night as well. Tuesday night as well, when I'm teaching for the Kli, but I want to mention it here. The idea of the corruption of the earth, if it is based on the mingling of the with these Bnei Elohim, whoever they are, but intermingling of species, animal and human species, then taking 2 of each species is a form of tikkun. It's a form of setting the world right. These 2 are going to begin again just with their species. Each one can mate with its own species. So there's an understanding here that the corruption is being rectified by bringing in 1 family, and the sons are married. Unlike a story which we're going to read next week of Lot and his who goes off, and then in next week and then the following week, Lot goes off, and we see that when he is saved, he and his daughters believe they're the only people left on earth. And then you have to have incest, if you believe you're the only ones left. Here there is clarity that Noach comes with 3 sons who have wives, and there's a continuation of the human species through the descendants of Noach. So this idea of repairing by putting 2 of each creature who can go on, and then Noach did everything that God has commanded. Now notice, all of this till the end of chapter 6 is Rishon, is the first Aliyah. So what we have in the first Aliyah is God telling Noach to build the ark and telling him that his sons will be with him on the ark, and telling him that 2 of every species will be on the ark. And it says the end of the first Aliyah is Noach did everything according to God, and he did it. And then chapter 2, the second Aliyah, which is the beginning of chapter 7, seems to repeat it. God says, take 2 of every animal, but it gives his age and his wife and his son's wife, and they go into the ark. So what you have in chapter 2 is the fulfillment of what he's instructed in the first Aliyah. And the waters are increasing. Then we get the third Aliyah, and the third Aliyah begins on verse 17 of chapter 7. The flood was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The waters are strengthening. The waters are covering the earth. And then within still this third Aliyah, God remembers Noach and the beast and the animals that are with him in the ark, and the waters subside, and it comes to the end of the 40 days. So you've got these 40 days. You come to the end of the 40 days. And at the end of the 40 days, Noach opens the ark, sends out the raven returns, he sends out the dove returns. All of this is part of the third Aliyah. And in Revi'i, the 4th Aliyah, verse 15, in chapter 8, God says to Noach, go forth from the ark, you and your family. So I want to remind you again, the first Aliyah is to a large extent, you've got the reiteration of what we read last week. Then you have the instruction to Noach that to build the ark, and he's going to be saved. In the second Aliyah, you have a reiteration of what you had in the first Aliyah, but with the clarity that Noach does it, that he goes in and he does what God has said to him. In the third Aliyah, you have the whole story of the flood, from the beginning to the end of the flood. And in the 4th Aliyah, you have them coming out of the ark, and you have building the altar, which is the first thing that Noach does. You have the reach nichoach, the pleasing odor of the sacrifice. So you have Noach responding with gratitude to God. This is the 4th Aliyah. Noach responding with gratitude to God, and God blessing Noach. And in that blessing, you have 2 really important messages. The first one is human beings are allowed to eat animals. Now, until now, according to the law, what God has said, human beings have to be vegetarian. Now you have human beings given permission to eat the animals. I'm going to come back to this in one sec. So you have that. And the second thing is human beings may not kill other human beings. Now, you might have thought, oh, we understood that already. Cain was told not to kill Abel. Cain was told don't kill Abel. But surely now we understand that we shouldn't have killed other human beings. But God is now saying, if you kill another human being, I'm imposing the death penalty. By the way, this is just a side note, nowhere in the Torah is there an explicit commandment against suicide. Doesn't appear. But when the rabbis legislate against suicide, they take it from here, because what they say is that what we're learning here is that every human life God demands accounting for. We also learn here at the same in the same place, they're built on this same verse. Remember, this is Revi'i. This is the fourth aliyah of our Parsha. We also learn here that if you are a witness to a murder, then you are required to step up and be a witness. This is a huge responsibility, because you are, as a witness, you are responsible to some extent for exacting the accountability that God demands for taking a life. Now, I want to stop here, because this is Revi'i. And as I have said to you before, one way of looking at every parasha is the idea that we build Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi, Revi'i, the climax, the key message, and then we're going to find parallels backwards. So Chamishi parallel to Shlishi, Shishi parallel to Sheni, and Shvi parallel to the first Aliyah. And I'm going to do that with this parasha. I'm going to also note that I am noting that there are comments in the chat section, but most of them are not directly related to this parasha. So I'm not going to deal with them now. Nathaniel in particular, at on another occasion, we can look at these comments. But the awareness that we are starting again from Noach and his sons has to be highlighted and noted there. We are starting with the opportunity to do things differently than we did them before. So the first thing to note is perhaps the whole problem of the corruption of the earth is that Hashem made a decision to start with just one human couple, Adam and Eve. And starting with just one human couple meant, of course, there's incest. By definition, the only way we can promulgate the species was by brother and sister mating and producing offspring. But we know that that would have been problematic. And maybe it took till the 10th generation, Noach's 3 sons and their 3 wives, that there was enough diversity to begin again, free from the problems of incest. I will add to that incest it's like with everything in the Torah, taking something too far to one extreme. Now, what do I mean? God is totally opposed, and this Parsha of Noach makes it very clear, to intermingling of species. We are given later on laws against intermingling of species of plants. We're not allowed to crossbreed plants, but crossbreeding of the animal world. And perhaps the message of these so-called B'nai Elohim, whoever they are, whatever they are, this idea that human beings were crossbreeding, we didn't know boundaries. We didn't know separateness. We didn't know difference. So on the one hand, you have incest, which is very, very close, keeping very close to your own species, and God doesn't want that. And on the other hand, and perhaps even more explicitly, God doesn't want us to crossbreed or not understand the difference. And here becomes an explanation for the permission to eat food, to eat meat, immediately preceding the idea of God exacting a vengeance for the bloodshed. Because what God wants human beings to understand, which it seems we had failed to understand to this point, is that human beings have to keep themselves separate from the other species. And there is, while there is permission to kill animals for food, As most of you know, hunting or killing for sport is not permitted, but there is permission given to kill animals for food. That does not ever cross over into permission to kill another human being. So the clarity that we get in this blessing when God takes Noach out of the ark and Noach offers a sacrifice, and then God gives him a blessing, the clarity of the blessing is this: I value human life, but human life has to understand its particular value. Human beings have to understand that they are not animals. Human beings need to be clear that there is a distinction between them and the animal world. Now, Rav Kook and others who were vegetarian and promoted vegetarianism said that permission to eat meat was part of the educational process to clarify our difference between us and the animal world, to help make it clear to us that animals were not creatures with whom we might consider having society, but rather they are that their place in the world is separate and different from ours. But that permission was educational and temporary, as opposed to a long-term vision. And God felt that we had needed it and we had become so corrupt. So Revi'i is actually quite short. It is the landing, it is the guest stepping out on dry land, and this particular blessing. Then we get Chamishi, and Chamishi is where God says, behold, I established my covenant with you. There's a beautiful covenant, there's a beautiful rainbow, and Noach gets drunk. Noach gets drunk. After, you would think that this beautiful rainbow, because he gets drunk at the beginning of Shishi, but you would think that what you've seen, this beautiful rainbow that's Shishi, this beautiful message from God, would seal something beautiful about Noach. And right at the beginning of Shishi, the very first thing he does is he gets drunk, and his sons, or at least one of his sons, mock him. So what have we got? Let's compare Shishi, as we said, Chamishi, as we said we would, to Shlishi. Shlishi is the time in the ark. The entire story inside the ark takes place in Shlishi. And Chamishi is this rainbow. Now we know that the rainbow is the tikkun, God's promise that he'd never again send a flood on the earth. The rainbow is a sign from God. In the ark, I just want you to remember, this family in the ark has responsibility to take care of all the animals. And part of being in the ark was teaching, it was really an enforced care of the environment or the animals. Noach and his family had no choice but to feed the animals, to look after the animals. They were sort of being trained to take responsibility for this earth. And they had no choice about it, because that's how it was. They were responsible for keeping these animals alive for all this time. It's an amazing thing when you think about it. And now God lets them free and gives them the sign. And what do we do as human beings as soon as we're let free? As soon as the absolute responsibility is taken away from us and we're back to having free choice, we let ourselves down. The minute we got, you see, while Noah couldn't let himself down in the ark, there was no way he couldn't let himself down in the ark. He had to keep these animals alive. As I'm going to point out on Tuesday night's Shir, so I'm just preempting for those who might be there. They said Noach and his family got no sleep all the time they're on the ark, because some of the animals were nocturnal. He had to look after them and keep feeding them. You know, God sometimes puts us in a situation where we're forced to take responsibility for something. And then he lets us free. It says, now I'm offering the world to you. See what you do with it. And what does Noach do with it? He gets drunk. It's maybe too much. It's maybe the release. But Shishi is the great disappointment. We're almost back to where we were. But notice, God had saved Noah because he believed he had some virtue compared to the rest of the world. But even the man with some virtue, after this period of confinement, lets himself and of all of humanity down. And it continues in chapter 10, the descendant of Noach, and it talks about all the offspring. And it seems to be giving just lists and lists and lists of offspring. And if you read it carefully, you will find that there are reasons to give the name of the offspring. And I will remind you just one of the things that we have talked about before is that we believe that there are 70 nations on earth. And if you do the math, you'll find out that you can actually derive the 70 nations from this, this line that we're given in Shishi. So Noach and his family, who were picked out as being separate and different from the corrupt people who were on the earth prior to the flood, have produced all the people on earth, including those who are evil, including our enemies, including those who do bad things. But this time God says, okay, I can cope with it. I'm going to work out a way of coping with corruption, providing human beings understand that they are not animals. The elevation and separation of humans from the animal world, which is the key in Revi'i. The final Aliyah, Shvi'i, is about the story of the Tower of Migdal Bavel, which I said I'm not going to go into in detail now, but it challenges us with to what extent it is good to be like each other and to what extent Hashem demands diversity. Hashem didn't want us all speaking one language. He didn't want us all having one idea. He wanted diversity, and Judaism picks up on that in so many ways. How do we determine what is actually halakha? We determine it through argument, through taking diverse points of view. When we talk about the 70 nations, there's another 70 that we have to remember at the same time, and that's Shivim Panim LeTorah. There are 70 faces in Torah. Anybody who thinks they understand Torah and hasn't derived 70 meanings in every word, in every verse, in every passage, well, then we haven't finished the job. We've still got a lot more work to do. So God is demanding diversity from us, respectful diversity within the bounds of humanity, and also within the bounds of our own particular type of humanity. Diversity within humanity, but humanity as separate from other species. That seems to be a key message in this week's Parsha. And just as we had the 10 generations listed at the end of last week's Parsha, which took us to Noach, we have the 10 generations listed in this week's Parsha, which is taking us to Avraham. So there is parallel there as well. So I think I've covered what I wanted to from the text, and I am delighted because my timing is also what I wanted, because now we can go to the handout for the second half of this Shir, and I hope everybody's able to bring it up. I'm not going to read through the whole handout. I'm just going to guide you through it. And I took one of Nechama Leibovitz's lessons. Of course, she has many more on each parsha, but I just took one because Kasuto does what I was trying to do to some extent, and that is he divides the chapter into acts or stories, and he says there's two parts to the flood story, and the first part is the building to the climax of the waters beginning, and then the second part is God's mercy, letting the act, let the waters stop, gradually more and more light. We get the rainbow and the covenant. So he divides it up that way. And he asked the question about what was the wrongdoing that had led to the flood. And we see that according to Nechama quoting Kasuto, the killing of Abel by Cain and the idea that right and wrong can be derived from power or strength. This is the beginning of the moral degradation. And the moral crime is that the earth was filled with violence, and there seem to be two types of violence. The first one we've talked about over and over again, sexual. And the second type is robbery. And I just want to make a comment here, because I think we are in a quite a violent era. We're living through quite a violent era at this time, and the violence worldwide, and the violence isn't directly or necessarily directly about robbery, but I can see when I see Gezel here, I must admit that I was listening to the Cardinal of Vienna. I think I've mentioned him before to you. Cardinal of Vienna talking about what he's going through with coronavirus. And he is a few years older than me, but he was born after the Second World War. And he said, until now in his life, he's never really known any hardship. In Vienna, since the Second World War to now, there hasn't been real violence or a real challenge. And I've grown up like that too. I've grown up Australia and then coming here, and I haven't really known real challenges. And I think that, of course, there are parts of the world, and particularly in Africa and Asia, particularly, but not only. Of course, we know the former Yugoslavia. There have been places of tremendous conflict and tremendous hardship. But many of us as Europeans, Australians, North Africans, we haven't really experienced the challenge or the difficulties that previous generations have experienced and people in other places have experienced. So we've been cocooned. But now at this time, we are all sharing a challenge. And I'm seeing in Israeli society, and I know it's true in other societies, certain violence that has been always there under the surface, but it's coming out. One of the elements of violence, of course, here that's coming out, or that we're seeing more, is more in the public eye, is the violence against women, the domestic violence, which is, in the times of pressure coming out, even in, sunny, happy Australia, domestic violence has seen a tremendous growth as a result of lockdowns. And there's also violence. It's really interesting. I was shared a video of police violence in Australia against demonstrators, because unlike here, demonstrations were actually forbidden with the lockdown. And the police took this very, very seriously. But I'm looking at North America in particular, and the violence associated from both police and demonstrators. human beings under pressure resort to violence. And this is the word Hamas used in the Torah here refers to violence of all sort. There's another relationship. So violence is one thing I wanted to bring up as the word Hamas. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is lack of respect for each other's properties is often associated with or related to lack of respect for each other's persons. So our person and our property, and the inability to respect the other as a person and the other as the owner of property. So all these things, this violence that was on the earth, I think that we're getting some insights into it in this under pressure, how people can respond with violence. And one type of violence or one type of absence of respect flows on and is connected to all other types of violent behavior. I'm looking at in the handout at the top of page 2. Here is what our sages comment on the subject in the Talmud Sanhedrin. Says Rabbi Yochanan, come and see how dreadful is the power of violence. For behold, the generation of the deluge committed every conceivable transgression, yet their fate was only sealed when they put forth their hands to robbery. As it says, the earth was filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them from the earth. And I think this is what I wanted to say here, that somehow in all of our societies, we don't notice a lot of the violence that goes on underneath, behind the scenes. Robbery is somehow, it's a public sort of violence, because one person will say, he took from me, and I can identify what he took from me. But what Rabbi Yochanan is saying, and what we need to understand that the Torah is saying, is that there's an undercurrent of violence that may only be visible through robbery, but robbery isn't the worst part of it. We sometimes need the visibility of the robbery to identify it. I'm going to jump to the paragraph that says, the Midrash weaves in the theme, come and see, why did the Holy One, blessed be he, command Noach to make the ark? In order that mankind should see him engaged in the construction and repent of their ways? Could not the Holy One, blessed be he, have saved him by his word, or have borne him up to the heaven by faith? And said to make him an ark of gopher wood. Why does he make an ark of gopher wood? Because he had to go and cut the wood. And look, what they're saying is, in our Parsha, what God wanted to do was start the world again. But he still left it possible for those who were living at the time to be part of starting the world again, to be part of it, but we failed to take up the challenge. God, according to Midrash, Noach built that ark for 100 years. And in all that time, nobody else said, I want to be part of it. Now, as I've brought you in the part of the reading, Rabbi Sachs points out, based on classic commentaries, that Noach also failed. That's why he's only called righteous in his generation, because he didn't convince anyone else to join him. But we can also see that humanity failed. And again, if we're taking this as a parable for the way we lead our lives, there are so many signs around us to change, to do better, and so difficult for us to see the signs, to learn the lessons that are actually put in front of our eyes. And that is part of human nature, is we simply don't see the message in front of us all the time. I've brought some of the classic commentaries. I brought Jonathan Sachs on leadership. I've brought Kasuto on chapters 10 and 11, which I pointed out to you, the 6th and the 7th aliyot. And Kasuto says, the same Kasuto that we told you at the beginning of the handout is talking about the structure of the flood story. He says, if we try to understand the text properly, we'll see that ethnology is not its intention. This chapter does not come to teach us ethnology, just as the first chapter of Genesis is not concerned with teaching us geology or paleontology or other sciences. The Torah does not offer its readers knowledge for its own sake. The information about people is not the main purpose, but a means of attaining it. The new race of mankind that emerged after the deluge was a unity just as much as that which preceded the deluge. It also sprang wholly from one couple, and all the people were brothers to each other. This outlook serves as a foundation for the prophetic latter-day message that no nation shall lift up sword against nation. What Kasuto is doing here is trying to give us the message. Remember what we had said. Why does God create all of humanity from just one couple? The Midrash says, in order that no person should say, my ancestors are superior to your ancestors. Now, we've just said creating humanity from just one couple brought with it problems of incest, and that's problematic. But Kasuto says, yes, but also remember, Noach and his sons were one family. We still all have to say, my ancestors are not greater than your ancestors, even though sufficient genetic spread diversity is now created. We still can't say my ancestors are greater than your ancestors. Abarvanel is making a comment about Nimrod, which I think I'll leave for now, because I wanted to talk about this month, which we begin the first of the month. It's Rosh Chodesh today, but the first of the month is actually tomorrow. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this month of Mar Cheshvan, because if you remember, I pointed out to you, oh, sorry, before I do this, I mustn't do this. I just want to know if there's anybody who wants to make a comment or ask a question related to what we've said about Noach before I talk about the month, which is what I want to do for the remainder of the lesson. So did anybody want to make a comment or ask a question about what we've said about Noach? Either the story or the person. Am I?
Yeah, no, can I, yeah, is that okay? Was he given any grooming? Sort of like, God picked him, but like, if you're going to go for a job, let's say, you're picked because of who you are, but you don't just walk into the job because you've got to be groomed for it.
I think that you've made a very interesting point. Midrash doesn't...
I did not understand the question, sorry. What was the question?
Was Noach given any special training to be, now he's now the new father of mankind? So the question, I think it's a wonderful question, and I'm not familiar with Midrashim which talk about it in any detail, except that God, if we go back and we say God tells him the exact dimensions of the ark and the exact materials he has to use for the ark, you extend that midrashically to that God gave him precise instructions for everything he had to do in building the ark and on the ark. But you are leaving open a wonderful question about the extent to which Noach was then on his own devices. And I think that one of the things that we see in this Parsha, the previous one, the following one, is a story of, it's like the development of human beings from children to young adults. And there's a beautiful little midrash as well. And I'll see whether I can find the words in the Parsha. I may not be able to find it. So you'll have to forgive me, but there's a beautiful midrash which says that God walked in the garden with Adam. God walked in the garden with Adam, side by side, because Adam was his first child, and he's holding his hands, and he's walking side by side. And then the Midrash says, and Noach walked behind God. Noach followed God. He did what God said to him. I said I was going to look, but at the end of Rishon, for example, Vayas Noach kekol asher tzivah, he did everything that God told him. He followed behind. He walked behind. And again, the child imitating the parents, learning from the parents, is a little bit different from, sorry, I'm going to get it. I've got it wrong. This is terrible by answering a question and not preparing not preempting the thing, because actually I've got it wrong, because what it says is Noach walked before God. Noach was like the child that you let walk. Okay. No. I'm doing it all wrongly. Wipe everything I've just said. Because in fact, it's going to be God walked with Adam, that Abraham walked before God, that Moshe could walk behind God, like the child that you now trust and knows can go their own way, which is why I could see the back of his head. Sorry, I've got it wrong. Noach wasn't in that story at all. So wipe everything I just said. However, having said that, I can say that we are watching the development of human beings from childhood towards maturity and adulthood and full responsibility. And what we see in last week's Parsha is this idea of the human being not understanding what's right and wrong, not understanding what's forbidden and prohibited. Everything seems to be, we get it all wrong, and God has to keep correcting us. So when it comes to the generation of Noach, God has lost all patience, but he finds this one person, Noach, who seems to be ahead, above the generation. He has some sense of right and wrong. God sees hope in him. God sees potential in him. But I think, Simon, that by asking that question, you've pointed out that maybe he still needed a lot more help, because he does fall by the wayside. He does get drunk immediately. Maybe he hasn't got enough guidance. And maybe that's why we're getting to the point where God is going to now deal with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in a much more intimate way, give them much more guidance and rules. You know, the beginning of what becomes Jewish law is given to them because they're more mature and more able to cope. And, you know, it just again reminds me of kindergarten children, that with kindergarten children, you can say yes and no all you want. To a large extent, it doesn't help. You actually have to physically hold them back from touching the thing that's dangerous. You have to put up barriers to protect them, because telling them isn't, when they're too young, it just doesn't help enough. And maybe that's what Noach was like, that he was still in that immature phase. Rachel, you want to say something? I can see.
I don't know. I don't mean to be, cynical or anything, but give Noach a break. He's just been 40 days and nights in that boat with all the animals.
A year, yeah.
And, actually in the text, it wasn't he that did really, in the way I read it, that he didn't do anything wrong. It was the son who came and made, told the others that he was uncovered and so forth. But I could see someone coming out of there, and how he got the grapes so quickly is a question. But I could see it as something, a very natural thing to do. The other thing I'd just like to mention is that Meir Shalev wrote that Mrs. Noach must have loved him very much to put up with all of this as well.
Yes, that will be more of my topic on Tuesday night. Okay, so look, thank you for asking the question. But in fact, I think that Noach is a fascinating character that we don't know much about him, except that he stepped above the violence and lack of respect that was all around him. Let's talk about the month, because just as I started off by telling you that Noach's name was chen backwards. So it was almost as if it was in the name. We talk about this month Cheshvan, and there's lots of plays on the word Cheshvan because we can talk about Hashuv or Lachshov, that it's a synonym, homonym, thinking, calculating, and so on. But the real name of the month is Ma Cheshvan. And Ma Cheshvan, the Ma part of it, turn it backwards and you get Ram. Ma means bitter. Ram means strong or high or elevated. Rama, something high. And the challenge for us in the month of Cheshvan is to take that which is bitter and elevate it. That is the true message of this month, always. And I want to emphasize that this is the month. Some say it's called Ma Cheshvan, bitter Cheshvan, because there are no holidays or festivals in it. It's the only month that doesn't have a particular special day in it. But I would like to suggest to you that in fact it's the month of greatest potential, and I'm basing that not just on my own understanding, but you'll see it's in some of the writings as well. The idea of our responsibility to transform, and maybe again going back to the story of Noach and how we are left at the end of the story. We're left with of course with Abraham at the end of the Parsha, but at the end of the story of Noach, we are left with this dilemma that Noach, who's done so much, and maybe he's entitled to get a bit drunk, but maybe we can also say the children who are supposed to be the heirs, they're the ones that have been saved along with him. There's still a lot of work to do to transform. So that idea. Now, it's also the 8th month if you count from Nisan, right? So remember, we can count the months of the year from Nisan, the 1st month, or Tishrei, which is the 7th month, but Rosh Hashanah. But this is the 8th month, and 8 is a mystical number, as I've told you and we've discussed many times before. The idea that the world was created in 7 days, so the 8th day is always a mystical day. That's the reason you do a Brit on the 8th day, because it's a mystical day, and 8 always represents some form of eternity, return to the beginning. I'm just jumping. So at the top of page 5, I have the note that the letter associated with the month of Cheshvan is the letter Nun. Nun is 50. Don't ask me to explain, because I can't, the Kabbalistic reason why Nun is associated with Cheshvan. Every month has a letter associated with him and with it. And I've brought a note from one of the Kabbalistic websites which tries to explain that. It says, the Cheshvan, the 8th month, is the month of Mashiach because 8 signifies the eternal revelation of the supernatural, the consummate state of rectified nature being the secret of the number 7. Okay, so 7 is nature, 8 is beyond nature. So what they say is 7 times 7 is 49. So beyond 49 is 50. That is the letter Nun. So I do quite like this. I always find these things amusing or entertaining. I don't know how seriously I take them, but I do like this idea to think about the fact that the letter Nun, which is a sort of mystical number, 50, if we talk about there are 50 gates to paradise, and we can only ever get to 49. We can never get to 50. In your Ashrei, which we say frequently in our prayers, there is a line for every letter of the alphabet except Nun. Nun is missing. Why? Because we can't achieve, one of the answers, we can't achieve that Nunness, that perfection. So 7 sevens, 49, the next, so eternally, 7 represents eternally within nature. 7 times 7, eternally within nature, 49. 50 is the next step beyond nature. So the month of Cheshvan is associated, the 8th month is associated with the letter Nun. And as you know, the letter Nun is just a straight line. So that can be also something nice. The mazal, the sign of Cheshvan is Scorpio. I think I've shared with you before that in Jewish, what's the word I'm looking for? The zodiac. In the Jewish zodiac, you begin on the 1st of the month. I was born Rosh Chodesh Adar. That makes me a Pisces, but in the secular calendar, I'm an Aquarius. And it being a Pisces, of course, changes my life. It's different from being an Aquarius. So taking the Jewish zodiac sign this month is now the Scorpion. And again, this idea of the Scorpion, the deadliest, why would you associate the deadliest member of the family as with the month that is considered the messianic month or the month with the greatest potential, transforming the Ma to the Ram, the month of 50, all these things. Why would you put the Scorpion? Well, I give you part of the answer at the bottom of the second paragraph. The secret is well known in Gematria, that the word Mashiach equals Nachash, snake. The Nachash, the symbol of all that is dangerous, tempting, the threat, the snake that tempts Eve has the same gematria as Mashiach. It's all about transformation, taking that which is dangerous and evil and turning it into something good. At the bottom of page 6, I remind you that the great flood took place in the month of Cheshvan. It's explicit in the text. It took place in the month of Cheshvan. Noah's generation was corrupt. God wanted to transform it. And so he took the negative energy of the month and you had this terrible flood. And then you left the ark in the same month a year later, and you had the rainbow. From the flood to the rainbow in this same month, from that which was at its lowest level to the beauty and the promise of eternity, the highest level. And now in this month, all the potential is there for all that is good. I should just add one tiny little thing that I didn't mention. I didn't clarify because I said at the beginning that you can find it. When you read this text more closely, the text of Noach, you'll find that it describes months as being 30 days, which is something that we don't have anymore. We go from new moon to new moon, which means months aren't equal number of days. According to one of my teachers, Rachel Elior, this is, again, part of the transformation that takes place, because only from after the flood do we have the rhythm of the months starting with the new moon. Before the flood, you would just had to count off 30 days, and so it wouldn't work anymore. So again, not only, and again, I mentioned the lengths of people's lives changes. So this flood is a change in nature, a complete change in the way the world runs. It sweeps everything away, and we start anew with a bright rainbow, with the colors of the rainbow. And maybe, Netanel, you inadvertently, in your earlier questions, which weren't really connected with the Parsha, you were reflecting something in the Parsha, because the colors of the rainbow, again, similar message to how we end with the story. I'm sorry, I realize I'm a fraction over time, but worth mentioning. Remember that we finish with this question of the Tower of Babel and the question of unity and diversity. And, we might think that being unified is good. All the colors of the rainbow, actually, as we know, light is actually white, or white. We talk about white as being the combination of the colors of the rainbow, but we think it's beautiful and good to actually see the different colors. And when we see a rainbow, we see a sign of God's goodness. But at the same time, we know that the rainbow is one being, or the rainbow is one thing, unified. Colors are diverse, but colors are the one thing. They're refractions of the same light. And that's part of the message too of this week's Parsha. So that's all there's time for, unless somebody wanted to make a comment or ask a question. Okay, so I'll see some of you tomorrow and look forward to seeing all of you next week, and have a wonderful, wonderful month. Chodesh Tov.
Hadash Tov.